The Maid Toddler gave a dying billionaire his last inhaler to save his life. What he discovered next changed everything. The Hartwell Grand Hotel stood like a crown jewel at the edge of Chicago's magnificent skyline, its glass towers catching the afternoon sun and scattering gold light across Lake Michigan like 1,000 scattered diamonds. 47 floors of polished marble, hushed corridors, and the quiet, invisible army of people who kept it all running. The ones who pressed the sheets until they were smooth as secrets, who scrubbed the grout between the tiles until it gleamed like new, who moved through the gilded hallways like ghosts, seen only when something needed to be done and forgotten the moment it was. Maria Delgado was one of those ghosts. She had been cleaning rooms at the Hartwell Grand for 6 years, arriving every morning before the sun fully committed to the sky, pushing her cart down the long corridors with the efficiency of someone who had learned long ago that time was the most precious thing she owned, and she owned very little of it. At 31, Maria had the kind of quiet beauty that went largely unnoticed, the sort that didn't announce itself but revealed itself slowly, the way a candle reveals a room, gradually, warmly, with a light that asked for nothing in return. But it was not Maria who would change everything on that particular Tuesday in October. It was her daughter, Rosie. Rosie Delgado was 3 years old and approximately 4.5 feet of concentrated sunshine wrapped in a hot pink dress that Maria had found at a church rummage sale for $2.50. The dress had tiny white daisies embroidered around the collar, a slightly uneven hem that Maria had stayed up until midnight trying to fix with a borrowed needle and thread, and a wide satin sash that Rosie refused to let anyone tie for her because she was, as she regularly informed the world in her serious, gravelly toddler voice, a big girl who does it herself. The bow she achieved on her own was always spectacularly lopsided, one loop the size of a grapefruit, the other barely a whisper, and it was, without question, the most beautiful bow Maria had ever seen in her life. Rosie was not supposed to be at the hotel that day. The daycare had called at 7 in the morning. A water pipe had burst overnight, flooding 2 of the playrooms, and they were closed until further notice. Maria's sister, who usually served as backup, was 2 states away at a cousin's wedding. The neighbor who sometimes helped had her own emergency. Maria had made 14 phone calls in 45 minutes, and at the end of all of them she stood in her small kitchen on the south side of Chicago with her coat half on, and her heart hammering and no solution in sight. She could not afford to miss a shift. Not this week. The electric bill was due. Rosie needed new shoes. She had worn through the soles of her sneakers so completely that Maria could see the outline of her daughter's small toes pressing against the canvas. And there was the matter of the cough medicine she'd been putting off buying for 2 weeks, telling herself it wasn't that serious, that the seasons were just changing, that Rosie would be fine. So Maria did what mothers throughout history have done when the world offers them no good choices. She chose the least impossible one. She dressed Rosie in the pink dress because it was the nicest thing Rosie owned, and Maria believed, privately and fiercely, that her daughter deserved to look like the treasure she was, no matter where they had to go. She packed a small bag with Rosie's worn stuffed rabbit, a floppy-eared creature named, inexplicably, Captain, a juice box, 3 crackers in a Ziploc bag, and a tiny board book about a caterpillar that Rosie had memorized so completely she could recite it with her eyes closed. She took her daughter's hand, knelt down to look her in her enormous brown eyes, and said, very seriously, "Mama needs you to be very quiet today and stay right by the cart. Can you do that for Mama?" Rosie had considered this with the gravity of a small person who understands that some requests are more important than others. "Yes," she had said. Then, after a pause, "Can I bring Captain?" "You can bring Captain." "Okay," Rosie said, satisfied. "I'm ready." And so they arrived at the Hartwell Grand together, the ghost and her sunshine, moving quietly through the service entrance as Maria always did, past the loading dock and the linen storage and the staff locker room that always smelled faintly of industrial cleaner and someone's leftover lunch. Maria signed in, collected her cart, and began her rounds, with Rosie walking solemnly beside her. One small hand curled around Captain's floppy ear, the hot pink dress a startling burst of color in the beige and gray of the service corridor. For 3 hours, it worked beautifully. Rosie was, by the standards of most 3-year-olds, remarkably patient. She sat on a folded towel at the base of Maria's cart in the empty corridors while Maria cleaned, quietly turning the pages of her caterpillar book and whispering the words to herself, occasionally offering Captain opinions about the story that apparently required a great deal of revision. She did not touch anything she was not supposed to touch. She did not run. She did not, except for one moment when she spotted a potted orchid and whispered, "Mama, flower," in tones of absolute reverence, make any noise that could have disturbed a single guest. Maria breathed. She worked. She thought maybe, just maybe, today would be all right. They reached the 41st floor at 11:47 in the morning. The corridor was quieter up here. The penthouse-adjacent floors always were, hushed and carpeted and smelling faintly of expensive cologne and the particular silence that wealth purchases for itself. Maria had 3 rooms to turn on this floor, 4102, 4107, and the corner suite, 4115. She started at the far end, as she always did, working her way back toward the elevator. Rosie settled into her spot beside the cart, opened her book to the page where the caterpillar eats through the apples, and began her quiet recitation. It was while Maria was finishing 4107, stripping the second pillowcase with the efficient, practiced motion of someone who has done it 10,000 times, that Rosie stood up. She didn't make a sound. She didn't call for her mother. She simply stood, tilted her head slightly to one side the way she always did when something required her attention, and looked down the corridor toward room 4115, whose door, Maria would later realize, had not latched properly and had drifted open perhaps 3 inches, just enough. Just enough for a 3-year-old with enormous brown eyes to hear a sound. It was not a loud sound. It was, in fact, an almost terrifyingly quiet sound, a thin, reedy, desperate kind of gasping that most adults would not have noticed over the hum of the ventilation system and the distant sound of the elevator. But Rosie heard it. She looked back at the room where her mother was working. She looked down at Captain. She looked down the hallway at the open door. Then she walked toward it, her lopsided bow bouncing gently with each step, her hot pink dress blazing like a small, determined flame in the quiet gray corridor, because Rosie Delgado was 3 years old and she had already learned, from watching her mother every single day of her small and precious life, that when someone needs help, you go. You simply go. John Hartwell had not planned to die on a Tuesday. He had not, if he was being completely honest with himself, something he had only recently begun to practice, planned for much of anything that didn't come with a return on investment. At 34 years old, John was the kind of man who appeared in Forbes before he appeared in his own family's photo albums, which was not a metaphor but a literal truth. He had been profiled in 3 major financial publications before his mother managed to get him to sit still long enough for a Christmas photograph. He ran Hartwell Industries, the conglomerate his grandfather had built and his father had expanded, from the 41st floor of the hotel that bore his family's name, and he did so with the particular brand of controlled intensity that people who don't know what else to do with their grief sometimes call ambition. The grief was not something John discussed. It lived in the locked room behind his eyes, and occasionally made itself known at 2 a.m. when the spreadsheets stopped working as an anesthetic, but during daylight hours it was buried under board meetings and acquisition calls, and the specific kind of exhaustion that masquerades as productivity. He had a personal assistant named Gerald who scheduled his meals. He had a personal trainer named Derek who scheduled his sleep. He had a therapist named Dr. Renata Vasquez whom he had been seeing for 8 months and to whom he had not yet told a single true thing, though he was, slowly, getting closer. What John did not have, on this particular Tuesday morning, was his inhaler. The asthma had been a companion since childhood, not the dramatic, emergency room kind that appears in movies, but the insidious, management-required kind that hums quietly in the background of your life like a low-grade alarm, asking only that you pay attention, that you carry your medication, that you remember, however inconvenient it might be, that your body has opinions and needs. John had managed it competently for 34 years with the same approach he applied to everything: systems, redundancy, preparation. There was an inhaler in his desk drawer at the office, one in the glove compartment of each of his 2 cars, one in his gym bag, one on his bedside table. The one that should have been on the bedside table of Suite 4115 had been knocked behind the nightstand 3 days ago, a fact that Gerald had noted in the to-follow-up column of his daily checklist, and then failed to follow up on because Gerald had been dealing with a vendor crisis involving the hotel's new towel supplier and some complex import regulations. A crisis that had consumed 48 hours of frantic negotiation and caused the inhaler situation to slide quietly to the bottom of the list. It was still behind the nightstand. John had been working from the suite that week rather than the office tower because the 41st floor corridor outside his usual office suite was being renovated, and the sound of the drilling had made concentration impossible. He liked this suite, liked its corner windows that looked out over both the lake and the city simultaneously, liked the way the morning light moved across the desk at 10 o'clock, liked the particular quality of silence on this floor that was different from the silence of his actual apartment in Lincoln Park, which was the silence of a place that had never been filled and therefore carried no echo of absence. He'd been on a call since 8 that morning. A complicated merger, 3 parties, 2 continents for lawyers, and a disagreement about regulatory compliance that had been circling the same 4 unresolved points for 90 minutes. John sat at the desk by the window with his laptop open and his phone on speaker, making notes in his precise, architectural handwriting, occasionally interjecting with the calm, decisive authority that his board members and business partners had come to rely on the way sailors rely on lighthouses, not warmly, but absolutely. He didn't notice the tightness at first. That was the thing about his particular variety of asthma. It rarely announced itself dramatically. It didn't clench or seize. It simply arrived, gradually and persistently, like fog. First the slight sense that the air was somehow thinner than it had been, then the subtle increased effort of each breath, then the awareness, growing steadily more insistent, that the lungs were working harder than they should be for results that were decreasing rather than stabilizing. He thought about the inhaler at 9:50. He told himself he'd get it at the break. There was no break. By 10:30, the fog had thickened considerably. His notes were becoming less precise. The lawyer from the London office was making a point about indemnification clauses that John could not quite follow, not because the point was unclear, but because the increasing effort of breathing was beginning to commandeer the mental resources he needed for legal comprehension. He pressed his palm flat on the desk, a grounding gesture he developed years ago, and calculated the distance between the desk and the nightstand. 12 feet, approximately. The call was at a critical juncture. If he stepped away now, even for 30 seconds, the London lawyer would take it as an opening, and the Paris lawyer would take the London lawyer's position, and they would lose 40 minutes of progress in his absence. He stayed. At 10:45, staying stopped being a choice he was making and started being something that was simply happening to him, which was a different and significantly more frightening thing. He managed to mute himself on the call and push back from the desk, and the 12 feet to the nightstand became something he was navigating rather than walking, his right hand trailing along the wall, his chest working with a concentrated, furious effort that was yielding rapidly diminishing returns. He reached the nightstand. He pulled open the drawer. He searched it with fingers that were not quite responding with their usual precision and found nothing: a phone charger, a notepad, 2 pens, a business card from someone whose name he could no longer read because his vision had developed a quality that he associated with a calm and clinical detachment that was itself a symptom of how serious things had become, with oxygen debt. He went to his knees beside the nightstand, not as a decision but as a concession to physics. He could hear the lawyer still talking on his phone on the desk, their voices distant and procedural, entirely unaware. He thought about calling out, but to whom? The room was empty. Gerald was downstairs. The corridor outside, as far as he knew, was equally empty. He thought, with the strange, crystalline clarity that extreme physical distress sometimes produces, of his mother, of how she had smelled of lavender and coffee, of how she had always known where he was, even when he hadn't told her, even when he'd been trying not to be found. He thought of how he had not visited her grave in 8 months because the act of standing in front of that stone and understanding that it was permanent was something he had not yet found a way to survive. He thought, I should have gone. He was still thinking it when the door drifted open and the hot pink dress appeared. Rosie Delgado stood in the doorway of Suite 4115, Captain dangling from her left hand, and looked at the man on the floor with his back against a nightstand and his face the color of winter sky, and she did not scream, and she did not run, because she was her mother's daughter, and her mother had taught her, not in words but in the 10,000 daily examples of her life, that fear is something you feel and grace is something you choose. She walked to him. She was 3 years old, and she walked to him. Her eyes traveled the room with a focus that was almost startling in its purposefulness, scanning, processing, understanding more than a child her age should have been able to understand. And perhaps that is one of the truths that gets buried under our assumptions about smallness, that children see more than we show them and know more than we tell them and are, in the ways that matter most, far more capable than we remember. She saw the small blue cylinder that had rolled under the edge of the bed skirt. It was half hidden in shadow, 3 feet from where John knelt, and she had never seen an inhaler before in her life. But she had seen her mother, when something needed doing, identify the thing that needed doing and then do it, and perhaps that was enough. She crossed to the bed. She bent her small knees. She reached under the bed skirt with one determined hand, and she retrieved the blue inhaler, and she brought it to the man on the floor, and she placed it in his hand, and she said, in her serious, gravelly 3-year-old voice, because this was the phrase her mother used when Rosie was struggling with something and needed to be reminded of her own capability. You can do it. You're okay. John Hartwell's fingers closed around the inhaler. He looked at the child in the hot pink dress. He used the medication. And he breathed. He did not get up immediately. The medication needed time to work, and his body needed time to believe that the emergency was over. And John Hartwell, who had not sat on the floor of any room since he was roughly Rosie's age, sat with his back against the nightstand and breathed, carefully and deliberately, and with a gratitude so enormous and so unfamiliar that it manifested not as tears, but as a strange, expanding stillness in the center of his chest. A sensation he would later describe to Dr. Vasquez as feeling like a window being opened in a room that had been sealed for a very long time. Rosie sat down across from him. Not because anyone asked her to, and not because she was afraid, but because in her estimation the situation called for company, and she was, when she had decided she liked a person, unambiguously generous with her presence. She settled onto the carpet with the cross-legged efficiency of a child who has spent her entire life sitting on various floors in various places, arranged Captain in her lap, and regarded John with a frank, unfiltered assessment that only the very young can deploy without it being considered rude. You are making a bad sound, she informed him. John, whose voice had returned along with his air, looked at her. Yes, he said. I was. Like this. She made a thin, reedy sound at the back of her throat, a surprisingly accurate impression that should have been alarming but was somehow, in her delivery, almost matter-of-fact. Yes, that's about right. My mama makes it sound like that when she's really tired, but she doesn't want me to know. Rosie considered this. But I know. John absorbed this information. Outside the windows, Chicago continued its vast and indifferent business, the lake glittering, the traffic moving, the city humming its usual complicated song. He had the peculiar sensation of having slipped sideways out of his own life and into something much slower and quieter and realer, as though someone had changed the channel to a frequency he hadn't known existed. What's your name? He asked. Rosie Elena Delgado, she said, with the air of someone who has recently mastered the full name concept and intends to use it at every opportunity. "This is Captain." She held up the rabbit by its ear. Captain, eyeless and exhaustively loved, dangled with great dignity. "Hello, Captain," John said. Rosie looked pleased that he'd addressed the rabbit directly. She considered him with slightly more warmth. "I'm John," he offered. "I know," Rosie said unexpectedly. John blinked. "You do. It says on the door." She pointed toward the entrance to the suite, where, on a small nameplate that John had never once noticed in the 3 weeks he'd been using this room, his family's name was engraved in polished brass. "Hartwell Suite." "My mama said, Hartwell. Is that you?" "It's my family," John said. "This is my family's hotel." Rosie absorbed this information the way children absorb most large concepts, by connecting it to something concrete and manageable. "So, you own the flowers?" she asked. "In the hallway?" "There's one pink one." I said flower, but I was quiet about it. John thought about the orchids his decorator had selected for this floor, which had cost approximately $800 per arrangement. "Yes," he said. "I own the flowers." "They're very beautiful," Rosie said, with the sincere gravity of someone issuing a considered review. "Thank you." A pause. From the desk, the distant sound of the lawyers was still audible. Someone was making a point about due diligence. The words sounded, from John's position on the floor, almost entirely abstract, like hearing a language you once spoke fluently from a very great distance. "Are you going to cry?" Rosie asked. John, who had not been aware that he was close to crying, discovered that he was, in fact, close to crying. "I don't know," he said, which was perhaps the most accurate thing he had said in a very long time. Rosie considered this. "It's okay if you do," she said. "My mama cries sometimes, and then she feels better, and then we have hot chocolate." A pause. "We don't have hot chocolate right now, but..." She reached into some invisible pocket in the seam of the pink dress and produced, with great ceremony, one slightly bent cracker. She held it out to him. John Hartwell, who ate at restaurants with Michelin stars and whose refrigerator in Lincoln Park was stocked weekly by a private chef, looked at the bent cracker being offered by a 3-year-old in a hot pink dress, and something happened inside him that was complicated and structural and long overdue. The way a foundation shifts not during the earthquake, but in the silence afterward, settling into a truer position. He took the cracker. "Thank you," he said. Rosie nodded, satisfied. She extracted a second cracker from the invisible pocket and ate it with the quiet efficiency of someone who has learned not to take snacks for granted. They sat together on the carpet of the Hartwell suite, the billionaire and the toddler, while the lawyers continued their distant negotiations and the lake glittered outside and Chicago went about its enormous, ordinary business, and neither of them said anything for a while, because sometimes the most important conversations happen in the silences between words, in the space where one human being simply sits with another and says, without saying anything at all, "I see you. You're not alone. Okay." It was into this silence that Maria appeared. She came through the open door at a pace that was not quite running but was one breath from it, her cart abandoned in the corridor, her face holding the particular expression of a mother who has noticed her child is not where she left her and has spent approximately 90 seconds in a state of controlled terror. She saw Rosie first, always Rosie first, and the breath she released was almost audible. Then she saw the man on the floor. And then she saw what her daughter had in her lap, the empty Ziploc bag that held the crackers, one of which, she now realized with a lurch of complicated mortification, her 3-year-old appeared to have given to the man who owned the building they were sitting in. "Oh my God," Maria said. "Mr. Hartwell, I am so sorry. She was right by the cart, and I don't know how she..." "Rosie, sweetheart, come to Mama. I'm so sorry, sir. I promise this has never happened before. She knows she's supposed to stay." "She saved my life," John said. Maria stopped. The words hung in the air between them, simple and unadorned, and so plainly true that there was no possible response to them except silence. I had an asthma attack, John said. My inhaler was under the bed. I was on the floor, and I couldn't reach it, and she found it.
He paused.
She found it and she brought it to me and she told me I could do it. Maria looked at her daughter. Rosie looked back at her mother with the expression of someone who has done the right thing and knows it and is not sure why it needs further discussion. Baby, Maria whispered. He was making a bad sound, Mama, Rosie said. Maria crossed the room and gathered her daughter into her arms, and she held her tighter than was perhaps entirely comfortable for a 3-year-old, and Rosie, who understood these things, put her arms around her mother's neck and held on back, and Captain dangled from one small hand against Maria's shoulder, and for a moment the three of them, the man on the floor, the woman on her knees, and the child in the hot pink dress, existed in a small circle of something that did not have a business name but was, in every way that mattered, the most valuable thing in the room. John watched them, and the window in his chest opened a little further. He had Gerald call Dr. Vasquez that afternoon. Not this time, to reschedule. To actually go. To show up and sit in the chair across from her calm, patient face and say the true things, not all of them. Not yet. He was not quite ready for all of them, but enough. He told her about his mother, whose name had been Catherine, who had died of a heart attack 14 months ago on a Tuesday in September, who had been the only person in his life who had ever offered him something without requiring anything in return. He told her that he had not cried at the funeral because he had been too busy being the Hartwell who handled things, who called the caterer and coordinated the guests and managed the details so that no one would have to feel the full weight of the absence while he was around, and that the weight had simply followed him home afterward and settled into the locked room and had been there ever since, heavy and uncatalogued and accumulating. He told her about the little girl in the pink dress. Dr. Vasquez listened, as she always did, with the full and undivided quality of attention that John, who was accustomed to being listened to by people who were simultaneously calculating their next response, had never quite gotten used to. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. She told you that you could do it, Dr. Vasquez said. Yes. And you hadn't heard that in a while. John thought about it. My mother used to say it, he said. Not in those words. But
he stopped.
She believed that I could do things before I did them. Not because of the company or any of that. Just because. He paused again. I think I stopped believing someone could see me that way after she died. And a 3-year-old saw you that way. A 3-year-old saw me on the floor, John said, and didn't see someone who had failed. She just saw someone who needed help and gave it. The thing about that, he was discovering, was that it had changed something fundamental in his internal architecture in a way that none of the productivity frameworks or strategic planning sessions or even the 8 months of mostly theoretical therapy had managed to touch. It wasn't a lesson exactly, it was simpler than a lesson. It was more like a reminder of something he had known once, and then, somewhere in the years of building and acquiring and achieving, had managed to misplace entirely. That people are not their results. That need is not weakness. That grace, the real kind, the kind that costs the giver nothing and changes the receiver everything, arrives without agenda and without condition and without any calculation of return on investment, and it sometimes arrives wearing a hot pink dress with a lopsided bow. He also began to discover other things. He discovered, through Gerald, who was thorough and quietly excellent and deserved a raise. Gerald received a raise. That Maria Delgado had worked at the Hartwell Grand for 6 years with a performance record that was, by every available metric, exceptional. He learned that she worked 5, and sometimes 6 days a week. That she was a single mother. That she had grown up in Pilsen, the daughter of Mexican immigrants who had worked 2 jobs each for their entire American lives and had sent 2 of their 4 children through college on the proceeds, and that Maria had been one of those children, had a business degree from DePaul University that she had earned at night while working days, and had intended to use it, and then found that the economy had different intentions in the year she graduated, which was the year of the pandemic and the year of the great dismantling, and that she had taken the hotel job as a temporary measure 6 years ago, and that temporary had calcified into permanent the way it does when children arrive, and bills compound, and the space between survival and the life you planned for narrows to a width that sometimes doesn't feel passable. He learned that she was raising Rosie on a salary of $17.40 an hour. He learned that Rosie's sneakers had holes in the soles. He learned these things not by asking Maria. Maria, he was fairly certain, would have answered his questions with careful, dignified composure and probably thanked him for his interest, because she was that kind of person, the kind who carries difficulty without performance and whose pride is not the brittle kind that breaks under pressure, but the deep kind that is actually something more like self-respect. But through Gerald, who had access to HR records and who carried out this research with his characteristic quiet efficiency, and then delivered the findings with an expression that suggested he too had feelings about them that he was professionally restraining. John sat with the information for 2 days. He sat with it the way he had never in his professional life sat with anything, not analyzing it, not strategizing it, not building a decision tree around it.
Just sitting with it.
Feeling what it felt like to know that the person who had arguably saved his life, whose 3-year-old daughter, had certainly saved his life, was worrying about electricity bills and shoe soles and whether the temporary cough medicine could wait another week. It felt, he discovered, completely unacceptable. Not in the entitled, reactive way of someone who has decided the universe requires correcting to suit their comfort. In the deeper, truer way of someone who has looked at a situation and understood, with sudden and permanent clarity, that what is in front of them is both wrong and within their power to address, and that addressing it is not charity. Charity implies a distance between the giver and the receiver, implies that the giver is whole and the receiver is lacking, but something different. Something more like debt, more like recognition. More like the long overdue acknowledgement that the world is held together not by the people whose names are on the buildings, but by the ones who show up every morning before the sun is fully committed to the sky and make the buildings worth inhabiting. And he thought about his mother, who had known this. Catherine Hartwell had been the daughter of a schoolteacher and a postal worker. She had married into the Hartwell money and had been, by every account, genuinely bewildered by the way it changed the people around her, but had refused to let it change her. She had known the names of the hotel staff, all of them, every hotel, every location, had asked about their children, remembered their birthdays, sent flowers when someone's parent died. His father had called it sentimental. His board members, on the occasions when she appeared at company events, had called her gracious, which John now recognized as what powerful people call a quality in others that they don't quite understand and can't quite monetize. She had called it basic. John, she had told him once, when he was about 14, and going through a period of believing that efficiency was the highest virtue, the only measure of a person that I trust is how they treat the people they don't have to treat well. Anyone can be decent when there's something in it for them. He had written that off at 14 as sentiment. He was 34 now, and he understood. He picked up his phone and called Gerald. "I need you to set up a meeting," he said. "With Maria Delgado." A pause. "The housekeeper from 41? "Yes." "Should I? Is this about an HR matter, sir? Because if so, the protocol is usually." "It's not an HR matter, Gerald." Another pause. Gerald, who had worked for John for 4 years and had developed, along with his professional competence, an extraordinary ability to read the specific silences in his employer's voice, said, "I'll reach out to her today, sir."
"Thank you," John said.
And then, because he was practicing, and Gerald about the raise. "It should have happened a long time ago. I'm sorry it didn't." Gerald was quiet for a moment in a way that suggested the restraining of feelings had become temporarily insufficient. "Thank you, sir," he said. Thank you." John hung up the phone and looked out the window at the city and the lake and the vast, ordinary, extraordinary life happening in every direction, and he thought about a 3-year-old on a hallway carpet with a lopsided bow and a rabbit named Captain, and for the first time in 14 months, what he felt, sitting with the complicated human weight of all of it, was not sealed in. He felt, improbably and completely open. Maria had worn her best blouse. It was navy blue, slightly faded from repeated washing but still presentable, with small pearl buttons that she'd replaced one by one over the years as they fell off, sourcing replacements from a button jar she kept in the kitchen drawer because her mother had kept such a jar and her mother's mother before her. She had pressed it the night before with a small iron she kept on the shelf above the washer, and she had worn it with her good black pants, and she had taken extra care with her hair because when you are walking into the office of the man who owns the building where you work, on a summons you don't entirely understand, looking like someone who deserves to be sitting in that office is not vanity, it is armor. Rosie was at the daycare, which had reopened. Maria had stood at the drop-off for an extra 30 seconds that morning, holding Rosie's face in her hands and looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite name. "Mama, you're squishing my cheeks," Rosie had informed her. "I know," Maria had said. "I love your cheeks." "I know," Rosie had replied, with the patience of someone who has had their cheeks squished many times and has accepted it as a feature of being beloved. Maria had laughed despite everything. She always did. The executive offices on the 39th floor were everything the service corridors were not. All warm wood and indirect lighting and the smell of fresh coffee and the particular ambient temperature of rooms maintained at a permanent comfortable neutral, as though extreme weather conditions had simply agreed not to enter. Gerald met her at the elevator. She recognized him from the times he'd passed through the housekeeping floors on building inspections, and led her with a warmth that was both professional and genuinely kind to a conference room with a window overlooking the lake. John was already there. She had seen him before, of course, in the way staff see executives, glimpsed in corridors, noted in passing, encountered as a presence to be professionally invisible around. But she had not, before the Tuesday of the pink dress, seen him from the floor, which was a perspective that had changed things. He stood when she entered, which she hadn't expected, and extended his hand, which she also hadn't expected, and said, "Thank you for coming, Ms. Delgado," as though she had had any practical choice in the matter, but the way he said it made it sound like a genuine expression of gratitude rather than a formality, and she found, to her slight surprise, that she believed him. "Of course," she said. "How are you feeling, Mr. Hartwell?"
"Better," he said.
"Because of Rosie." They sat across from each other at the conference table, and Maria folded her hands in her lap beneath the table because they had begun, very slightly, to tremble, not from fear but from the effort of appearing not afraid, which is a different thing and requires its own specific muscular engagement. John did not have a presentation, she noticed. No documents, no papers, no folder. Just his hands on the table and a quality of attention that reminded her, unexpectedly, of Rosie. That same full presence quality, that same sense of someone who has decided that this moment, this particular exchange, is the thing that matters right now, and not the 17 other things pressing for attention. "I want to apologize first," he said. Maria blinked. "I'm sorry." "You've worked for this company for 6 years, John said. "Exceptionally well, by every measure. And I didn't know your name until my 3-year-old daughter, until Rosie," he corrected himself, which she noticed, the deliberate attribution of her child's individuality, "came and sat with me on the floor and shared her crackers." He paused. "That's not the kind of employer I want to be. It's not the kind of man I want to be. And I'm sorry." Maria was quiet for a moment. She had prepared, on the subway ride over, for approximately 11 different versions of this conversation. This was not one of them. "Mr. Hartwell," she began carefully, "if this is about Rosie being at the hotel that day, the daycare was closed. I had no other option, but I understand if that's a policy violation, and I want to explain." "Maria," he said, "it's not about that." He took a breath. "I want to offer you a position." The room was very quiet. "A position," she repeated. "Director of Hospitality Operations," John said. "It's a real role. We've been trying to fill it for 2 years, and we've brought in candidates with hotel management credentials and corporate backgrounds, and none of them have understood what this building actually is, which is a place held together by the people who know every corner of it, who know how the linen smells and which orchids need extra water, and he paused. And she saw something move across his face that was not professional but personal and unguarded. Who notice when someone needs help and simply go to them. Maria's hands, beneath the table, had stopped trembling. They had stilled completely, the way things still when something important is happening and the body understands before the mind catches up. The salary is $98,000 a year, John said. Full benefits, including childcare subsidy. There's a professional development budget. The role includes oversight of housekeeping, guest services, and facilities management for this property, with potential to expand to the other 3 Hartwell properties once you're established. He stopped. I want to be clear that this is not because I feel I owe you something, though I do. This is because you are qualified for this role, and you have been underutilized for 6 years, and that is a failure on the part of this company that I intend to correct. Maria looked at him across the table. She thought about the electric bill. She thought about rosy sneakers with their ghost impression of small toes. She thought about the DePaul degree in the folder at the back of her closet, behind the winter coats, that she had not looked at in 3 years because looking at it made the gap between what she had planned and what she was living feel particularly unpassable. She thought about Rosie's voice that Tuesday morning. You can do it. You're okay. I would need to be evaluated on my performance, Maria said. Properly. Not given special treatment because of what Rosie did. If I do this, I want to earn it. John looked at her for a moment, and something in his expression settled. Some last residual corporate distance replaced by what she could only describe, later, to her mother and sisters in her mother's kitchen over the sound of cooking and children, as realness. I wouldn't expect anything else, he said. She took the job. The following October, 1 year and 11 days after a Tuesday that none of them would ever quite stop living inside, Maria Delgado stood in the lobby of the Hartwell Grand and looked out through the glass doors at Chicago doing its enormous, complicated autumn thing. Leaves letting go of things in a riot of orange and gold, the lake catching the low sun like beaten copper, the city in its perpetual beautiful motion. She had been director of hospitality operations for 11 months. There were things she was still learning, the budget language, the vendor negotiations, the particular dynamics of managing people who had, some of them, been skeptical of her promotion and whose skepticism she had addressed not by arguing but by showing up every day with the same competence and care she had brought to the housekeeping cart, just applied from a different vantage point. She had made mistakes. She had fixed them. She had earned, slowly and specifically, and on the basis of the work itself, the respect of her team, and the respect of her team was the thing she was proudest of, more than the business cards and the salary and the parking space in the attached garage. She had also, in the past 11 months, slept more than she had in years. She had taken Rosie to the pediatrician without calculating the cost against the grocery bill. She had bought Rosie shoes, actual shoes that fit, with room to grow, shoes that cost more than $2.50 from a church rummage sale, and if Maria had cried in the shoe store with Rosie on her lap while the salesperson measured her tiny foot, she had cried quietly and wiped her face before Rosie noticed. Rosie, for her part, had strong opinions about the new shoes. They light up, she had announced, stamping her foot to activate the sole's LED technology. They light up, Maria had confirmed. Captain likes them, Rosie said. He said so. Captain remained in excellent health, though he had lost what might generously be called his remaining eye sometime in August, and had taken on a philosophical air that Rosie found entirely appropriate. John Hartwell was not, technically, Maria's employer anymore. He had restructured Hartwell Industries in the spring, bringing in a new head of hotel operations under whom Maria now reported, because he had decided, after many conversations with Dr. Vasquez and several with his sister and one long, late-night conversation with Gerald that was mostly about grief, but that both of them had called something else, that he wanted to spend the next chapter of his life building things differently than the previous chapter had been built.
He was still involved.
He was present. He just held it differently. He had also, And this was the thing that Maria thought about most often when she thought about what had changed and what had stayed changed, and whether change was ever really permanent or just a season you hoped would last, gone to his mother's grave. He had told her, in the early weeks of her new role when they had sometimes met in the afternoons to discuss the hotel's operations and had found themselves, almost without deciding to, discussing other things as well, that he had gone on a Wednesday in November alone, in the early morning before the cemetery filled with the day's other visitors. He had brought dahlias, which had been his mother's flower, which he had known without having to be told, because some things live in you independent of memory. He had stood in front of the stone and let the weight of it be what it was. He had said what he needed to say. He had cried, not the controlled, private kind, but the full kind, the kind that costs something and returns something in the exchange. He had told Maria that when he stood up afterward and looked around the cemetery in the early winter morning, the thing he had felt was not better, exactly, but real. Like he had rejoined his own life after a long absence. Like the window that had been sealed was now, properly and permanently, open. "My mother would have liked Rosie," he said. "Tell me about her," Maria said.
And he had.
On the afternoon of that particular October anniversary, John arrived at the hotel lobby at 3:15, which was when Maria had told him, via a message through Gerald that had been careful and professional in its language, but unmistakable in its intention, that there was something he needed to see. He found her in the lobby, looking at the city, and next to her he found Rosie. Rosie was 4 years old now and approximately 5 feet of concentrated sunshine and considerably more verbal than she had been a year ago, which had seemed, to everyone who knew her, barely possible. She was wearing the hot pink dress. Not a new one, the same one. Maria had washed it carefully dozens of times and kept it in the back of the closet even as Rosie grew into it and then, technically, out of it, because she could not bring herself to part with the thing that her daughter had worn on the day that had changed everything, and Rosie, who was Rosie, had somehow intuited this and had, of her own accord, asked to wear it today. It was small on her now. The hem that Maria had fixed with a borrowed needle sat above Rosie's knees rather than below them. The sash still produced its magnificently lopsided bow. It was, if anything, more beautiful than it had been. John stopped when he saw it. Rosie looked up at him from approximately the height she'd been a year ago. She was tall for 4, which was a new development, and said, with the air of someone reconnecting with a valued acquaintance, "Hi, John." Not Mr. Hartwell. Not Sir.
John.
The way she'd said it the first time, on the floor of 4115, with the instinctive democracy of the very young who have not yet learned that some people are supposed to be addressed differently. He had never once asked her to change it. "Hi, Rosie," he said. She held up Captain. Captain was wearing, Maria noticed for the first time with some surprise, what appeared to be a small piece of ribbon tied around one ear and a bow, lopsided, naturally, with one loop significantly larger than the other, that was unmistakably hot pink. "Captain got dressed up," Rosie explained. "I can see that," John said. "He looks very handsome," Rosie considered. "He says thank you." They stood together in the lobby, the 3 of them, and Captain in the lobby of the building that bore one family's name and was built on another family's daily invisible care, and outside the city went on being enormous and ordinary and full of the 10,000 small unremarked moments that are accumulated and understood, everything that actually matters. John looked at Maria. Maria looked at John. Between them, Rosie had crouched down to investigate something on the lobby floor that had caught her attention, a small square of light cast by the afternoon sun through the glass doors, a perfect golden square on the marble that she was now testing the edges of with one light-up sneaker, watching the light respond to her foot with a focused scientific interest of someone conducting an important experiment. "Same time next year?" John said. "Same time next year," Maria said. It was, as promises go, a small one. But the small ones, Maria had learned this from her mother and her mother's mother, and from 6 years of mornings before the sun was committed, and from one Tuesday in October, and from a child in a hot pink dress who heard a sound that needed answering, and went. The small ones are the ones that hold. Rosie stamped her foot again, delighted, and the sneaker blazed with light. Captain observed the proceedings with the quiet dignity of a witness. And the window stayed open. For all the invisible hands that hold the world together, and for every child who ever walked toward someone who needed help, without hesitation, without calculation, because it was simply the right thing to do.